if the Japanese are able to consolidate what they've got with all the resources down in Southeast Asia, the ability to roam at will across the Pacific and to build up their industrial base themselves, this is a much tougher fight for the Americans later on. The Japanese ability even to build under pressure, under bombing, is quite great. I mean, they're churning out carriers again throughout the war. And so it'd be interesting to see if they've been given that breathing space, how much resistance there'd been. I have no doubt the Americans would have prevailed in the Pacific eventually because of the huge economic and industrial muscle they were able to bring to bear. I think one of the things that's critical from the Japanese point of view is how many experienced aviators they lost in this battle.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised some really big questions there, Chris, and we'll come on to the long-term consequences in just a moment. John, one thing I do want to ask you about is if McCluskey doesn't make the decision he makes, what is the effect of that?
Yeah, right. And there are actually two tactical decisions one after another. McCluskey's is first. Yeah, if he does not do his thing, I think you can make the argument that Soryu is going to get put out of business by Yorktown's planes. But yeah, if Enterprise's planes don't show up and knock out Akagi and Kaga, that's a problem for the Americans. We didn't talk about what actually happens, during the 1020 dive bomber attack. There's actually a communication snafu between McCluskey and his second squadron leader, a guy named Dick Best, who's running Bombing Squadron 6. And what ends up happening is two squadrons end up attacking Kaga. And only at the very last minute does Dick Best and two of his wingmen suddenly make this realization that, oh my God, Akagi, the flagship, is getting away scot-free. And Dick Best takes these two other guys and goes over and attacks the Akagi. And with just 3 airplanes, he puts his bomb right on Akagi's flight deck, in the middle of her flight deck, and knocks her out. That's another huge moment in and of itself, because if Akagi escapes that 1020 dive bomber attack, she has one of the most experienced torpedo plane squadrons in the world. There's a guy on board her named Murata, who's the dude who led the attack against Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor. He's the last guy in the world you want to, make it out of this attack intact. And so what could have happened, if Akagi's air group gets added into Hiryu's air group, that's a whole different kettle of fish too. So as you said earlier, luck plays a huge role in this thing. I'm more skeptical of the Americans losing 3 aircraft carriers. I could see them losing 1 or 2. It's very difficult for me to anticipate that they would have lost 3. But even a draw in this battle is bad for us, because we start this war in a position where the Japanese have got 10 large or smaller flight decks, and we've only got 3 or 4, depending on the date. What Midway gives us from a big picture perspective, winning this battle, is that we sort of drag ourselves up to parity with the Japanese in terms of carrier flight decks. And that allows us then to start thinking about, how do we reshape this war and, go over to the counterattack. That would not have been possible for us if we lose, 2 or even 3 aircraft carriers. Now, a counteroffensive is just out of the picture.
Well, let's build on that.
Jonathan, do you think that if Akagi and Kaga had survived those attacks, that the American carriers would have run away, taking Nimitz's advice at that point, rather than actually staying and waiting for the attack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that certainly Spruance and Fletcher would have fought at arm's length and would have been in a position to, if the battle does start going against them, yeah, let's get out of here. That's the thing about the handling of Hiryu that to me is just so idiotic during the afternoon, is that, Nagumo and his subordinates should have known Hiryu's air power is going to go down into a downward spiral. I want to keep this carrier in position where, yeah, I'm going to counterattack at range, but when things start going south, I'm going to beat feet and get out of there. I do think that Spruance in particular has the ability to place his actions within a larger strategic context and to say, if this thing is not good, yeah, I'm going to get out.
John, I want to ask you about what the reaction would have been from a US perspective, had the Battle of Midway played out differently, had it been lost, let's say they had 2, 3, however many carriers destroyed. I mean, we're talking about 7 months on from Pearl Harbor. How does this change the US approach to the Pacific and the US mindset in terms of the wider context of the war?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, we're all using our little crystal balls here, and the crystal balls get murkier and murkier the further out we go from these events. You can spin this 2 different ways, I think. If we lose the battle, maybe Nimitz gets canned, maybe his boss, Admiral King, gets canned. He's under tremendous pressure at this point, too. But I could see it going either way. I could see the Americans saying, oh, okay, we lost here, but by God, we're going to double down, and, we're really going to start focusing on the Japanese because they're clearly a very serious threat to us, and they're threatening our territory in terms of Hawaii. Maybe that ends up redoubling American efforts in the Pacific, and it sucks away resources that would have been used for the fight against Germany. Conversely, I think you can also say maybe the Americans do get demoralized, and they're like, we got bigger fish to fry. We're going to turn and face Germany and really put more of our eggs in that basket. I don't know how that plays out. I think you can make arguments for both.
Chris,
what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, where do you come down on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Americans at this stage would have said, look, we were outmatched 6 months after Pearl Harbor. We were probably looking at a defeat, actually, so they would have absorbed it. I think the Americans would have said, look, we're just going to come back stronger. We're really mad about Pearl Harbor. We're even more mad about Midway. And they almost would have said, well, Midway's a long way away. This is not continental United States. It's not Hawaii. I think an attack on Hawaii after this might have been a problem. Politically,
do you think they'd have gone after Hawaii, potentially?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Jonathan and I have discussed this. Part of the original Pearl Harbor plan had an invasion force attached to it. So the Japanese were thinking in those terms, and it was always going to be a possibility. What you have to remember is Midway sits at the end of an archipelago that leads down into the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a possibility. I mean, the Japanese always thought big in terms of tactical actions. So that would have been possible. But I have absolute confidence that the strategic stamina of the United States would have swung in here. I think it would have been harder to concentrate on both the European theatre and the Pacific. I think what the Americans would have done is probably gone on to the defensive in the Pacific and said, right, we're holding the line here. They've got a lot of submarines with bad torpedoes, but they've got submarines. They've got a lot of air power. In the European theatre, that has said, stick with Germany first. We'll defeat them. And will hold the Japanese off. While the Japanese, I think, would have been consistently trying to convince the Americans to come to terms. That's how I think it would have played out.
John, can I ask you a question? What would the impact of Japan not being defeated so spectacularly in this battle, and therefore being stronger in the Pacific region, what impact would that have had on Russia?
Yeah, okay. Because that's one of the things that the top policymakers like FDR and Churchill are really focused on during this year. 1942 is the critical year in the war, I'm convinced. And the USSR is in terrible shape. And so the last thing that we want to see from an Allied perspective is the Japanese becoming more aggressive in Manchuria, potentially going after the Red Army. That's one of the reasons that we're trying so desperately to keep the Chinese in the war, because we see them as a sump and a magnet for Japanese land forces. So you have to wonder, too, does a defeat at Midway potentially imperil the Lend-Lease shipments that are going across the Pacific in Russian ships, let's be clear, that are bringing a lot of material into Russia? Do we suddenly start feeling a lot dicier about sending that Lend-Lease material over to the Soviet Union at that point, which is hugely important to them? There's a lot of knock-on effects here. The other one I've mentioned too is Australia. We should mention that.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, just on the Russia thing again, of course, there's a very large Russian army facing a possible Japanese assault in the Far East, and that army is moved west after Midway, and of course takes part in the Battle of Stalingrad.
There's a lot of Some of that is mythological, but you're right. I mean, the Red Army does keep substantial forces in Manchuria precisely because they don't want to get stabbed in the back by the Japanese. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of scholarship around just what percentage of those forces actually did make it to Stalingrad or not. Personally, I believe that the majority of them were raised from the Moscow military oblast and that sort of thing. But, you know, overall, great point.
Well, that would be a massive what if. I mean, let's just play that out briefly. So let's say Stalingrad, we say potentially Stalingrad plays out differently?
Well, it's not Stalingrad in particular. It's, as Jonathan hints, you know, the ability of the Russians to flex manpower such that they can release manpower for Stalingrad is the issue. Also production, supplies and things like that over long distances. So there is definitely...
I was just going to say, a lot of the raw materials that are coming from the U.S., we're supplying half of Russia's aluminum. And that's, you know, airframes and also tank engines. T-34s run on an aluminum engine block. So, you know, any diminution of that Lend-Lease aid has a direct impact on the combat capabilities of the Red Army.
I mean, I think the big deal about this is I think you look at the way Japanese industrial production was ramping up at this stage with access to raw materials, fuel from the rest of the Pacific. They were a much more daunting proposition for every opponent at this stage. And we've got to remember that, you know, the Japanese had an expansive attitude to this greater Pacific co-prosperity sphere. I mean, you know, if you go fast forward, it's what China's trying to achieve in the Pacific right now.
Well, let's talk about Australia as well. What are the implications for Australia?
Well, yeah, we look at Australia as sort of the launching pad for attacks that can go back and into Indonesia and recapture those regions. And we've kind of taken over the defense burden from Great Britain in terms of guaranteeing Australia's safety at this point. As my friend Rich Frank, another fine Pacific War historian, puts it, anytime the Japanese threaten those supply lines to Australia, it's like stepping on our sciatic nerve, and we react very, very vigorously. So, you know, maybe we can't counterattack into the Solomon Islands as a result of having lost at Midway, but, you know, if holding the line in the Pacific is now the order of the day, I can guarantee you that the Americans are going to fight very vigorously to preserve that supply line running down to Australia.
Yeah. Chris?
So, yeah, I mean, I think the next action by the Japanese would have been a repeat of the Coral Sea. I genuinely think that if you're looking at it from Tokyo's point of view, break that link. As you say, it's a great image, Jonathan, a sciatic nerve. And none of the South Pacific campaign happens if you break that link. And you're committed, if you're an American strategist, to do the Admiral King plan, if you remember, Jonathan, which was essentially go through you know, the Solomons initially as a defensive move, but you have to end up in the Marianas. I mean, what is interesting about all of this, I don't see any situation where the Manhattan Project doesn't happen and Japan gets nuked.
I mean, that's a really big question. John, to get your take on that, I mean, does the war get extended or does the bomb still get dropped?
Both. I think that, if we lose at Midway, that disallows our ability to get this campaign going in the Solomons, which is actually absolutely crucial for kind of gearing up the attritional sausage grinder, if you will, that's going to, you know, grind up the Japanese military.